Hey, I'm delighted to be joined today by progressive Christian theologian and philosopher Eric English. Eric blogs and podcasts at Unenlightenment and is the author of the book Unenlightenment, A Theological Foundation for Deconstructing and Reconstructing the Christian Faith, which is right up my alley. But today we're going to be talking about another book. This is just coming out in January of 2025. It's titled Kingdom of Man, The Kingdom of Man, Evangelicalism and the Distortion of Christianity. Now, before we launch into it, I'll just say this. Just today, I was reading through USA Today. This is October 25th, 2024. And there was an op-ed published by Nicole Russell titled Christian Nationalists May Elect Trump. And that has me worried. She's not the only one. I'm worried too. I want to better understand this political, theological, and cultural morass that we find ourselves in. And I can't think of anyone better to talk about it with than Eric English. So, Eric, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. All right. So, let me begin with a kind of general author's question before we dive in a little further. The Kingdom of Man, what prompted you to write this book?
So, you are probably familiar with Kristen Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne. Probably most of your audiences as well. So her book was a political, cultural, historical analysis of evangelicalism and the role that white Christian nationalism plays in that. And after reading that, I thought to myself, well, I wonder if there are theological and philosophical things that need to be explored as well, because she does it, and ecclesiastical things really, because she sort of hints at some of those, but doesn't, that's not her thing. So she didn't go into those. And I began uncovering so many things that just began connecting the things that we're experiencing in our culture today with those we'll call them underpinnings, theological and philosophical underpinnings. It's almost the inevitable result of these things that were set in motion over the last 100 years or so.
Okay,
And so
yeah,
that's what the
go ahead.
kingdom of man is.
Okay. So you're kind of you're given a state of play and looking at the theological, cultural, historical, political underpinnings of it.
Yeah. And so the kingdom of man is, we have this there's this belief out there, especially within white Christian nationalism, that in some way we have this ability to bring forth the kingdom of God. And really what we're doing, first of all, I don't find that to be a biblical notion. But second of all, I think that when we do that, we're not really bringing about the kingdom of God, because we don't have the ability to do that. It's more like the kingdom of man. And really, the flow of history within evangelicalism has given rise to such a um, need and desire for power that I think that has just eclipsed what their original intentions were. Because I want to be clear at the outset, I don't think that most evangelicals are doing certain things on purpose. Like, I don't think that there's this grand conspiracy out there to establish the new world order or whatever it is that the end times folks like to talk about. I think that much of what we see is a subconscious, the sort of subconscious result of what we've seen, the inevitable subconscious result of what we've seen travel throughout history to today.
Let's define things. So what is white
Yeah.
Christian nationalism? And I think I know that some of the people probably that most need to hear this are already rolling their eyes like, oh, here we go again. Right. So what is that? And how could you explain it as a current reality that we should be concerned about?
So I'm often surprised at how much kickback I get when I use that term. In fact, I was surprised in some of my more recent blog on Pathos blogging of just how uh, charged and loaded that term is. Um, and so let's define it first. So white Christian nationalism is, if you separate the things out, white Christian and nationalism, first, nationalism is different from patriotism. A nationalist is one who holds a nation above and beyond other belief systems that they may have. So those three things, being white, which is their culture or culture, uh, Christian, which is their religion, and nationalism, which is their political affiliation. And so you bring those three worldviews together and you get white Christian nationalism. Now, white Christian nationalism is not new. It's become new and within our vernacular, but it has always existed within evangelicalism. It has just throughout history manifested itself in different ways. Now,
Can
most
I just
people
ask
won't
one thing? Can
call
I
them.
just
Oh,
can I ask
sure.
one thing? Maybe to talk about these three parts, the white, the
Yeah,
Christian, the nationalist. First, let's talk about white for just a moment. So, can a person who's non-Caucasian be a part of white Christian nationalism?
they can. And it's they can because they're associating themselves with all of the uh, elements that make up that worldview. And I mean, I know plenty of African Americans who, for example, are devout religious people who would classify themselves as that. They wear the mega stuff, all that stuff, because they identify so much with it. They may just be Christian nationalists. I mean, that term would apply too, but they're not. Uh, the white part of that has to do with power. And I think when other nationalities begin associating themselves with that, that's, I think, their way of trying to get some of that power as well.
It's like a few years ago when Donald Trump was president, he talked about uh, wanting more immigrants. Why can't we have more immigrants from Norway? And then criticizing immigrants from what we refer to as shithole countries from Africa and Haiti. Would that be pandering to a white Christian nationalist mindset?
Yeah, and the thing, part of the reason we white is there is because it's a history of, when you, I think that the reason most people hate the term white Christian nationalism is because the first thing they think of are people in white capes, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, but that is part of the history. That's the thing. You can't just rewrite history. That is part of your history, and it's had been such a integral part early on that it embedded itself in the subconscious of evangelicalism, and it just sort of would pop up every now and then throughout history as needed.
I think often people don't recognize not only is racism a continued reality, but how close in proximity a lot of the overt racism is in our history. So, for example,
Yeah.
Bob Jones University, I think it was up to the year 2000 that you could not have interracial dating on campus. And people are like kind of stunned to hear that, but that is just a reality of the history. Uh, what about the nationalist part? So is there a role to believe that one's nation has a favorite status as a city on the hill, for example, without being a nationalist about it?
So so nationalism is an ideology, and I often hear people conflate patriotism or being a patriot or loving one's country and nationalism. And so, but they really need to be a distinct thing. And so I think what you've said is you're talking about patriotism. And yeah, absolutely. I consider myself a patriot, but I'm not a nationalist. But I love this country, but I love God more. And so I'm not a national. A nationalist is one who adheres to their ideology as elevated above all other things. And a patriot is one. It's more of a societal thing. It's part of their identity, but it's not raised to the status of, I'm a Christian, I'm a nationalist, and I'm white. Like those are the top three most important things.
I think often, is it fair to say that often the nationalism and patriotism really blur together, and that's what makes nationalism so insidious? And I'm thinking, for example, 20 years ago, when in the United States, you could not question the war in Iraq early on, or you could end up like the then called Dixie Chicks who were getting death threats because they had said
Yeah.
they were embarrassed that George Bush is from Texas. And looking back now, it's hard to find anybody who would defend the invasion of Iraq. I think it was in March of 2003 as a wise geopolitical
Mhm.
or justified geopolitical action. But is that an example where often the nationalist sentiment is just underneath the surface of what is ostensibly patriotism, but could quickly become nationalist?
Um, Possibly, but I think that perhaps we would say that it would be accurate to say that overzealousness, an overzealous patriot, can very easily become a nationalist. You might think of it like, there is a difference between saying being a conservative evangelical and a fundamentalist, right? Um, but one can easily lead to the other if one's not careful.
Okay, I think a lot of people have a sense that something has changed in the last 9 years since Trump rode down the
Yep.
golden escalator. I certainly have a sense of that. Is that a correct perception? And if so, how has Christian identity and nationalist sentiments changed during Trump versus prior to Trump?
So it's an interesting, if you look through history and look at the trends and kind of see what bubble, if you know what to look for when you're looking at the various events, it's interesting because you might say, I hear people say that like the election of Trump was sort of the pinnacle or the crescendo of what's been bubbling up or going on for decades. That he's sort of like, this is the inevitable result, but he's more of like the beginning. He's more of one who has ushered in a new thing. He's evolved that historical situation into something different. And so this isn't going to end. It's going to keep moving forward, and it's going to continue to redefine itself as it moves forward. But I don't think we're going to see an end to white Christian nationalism anytime soon, or the type of, if you can call it a philosophy that Trumpism adheres to. Those things are just, we're just now labeling something that has been going on, but Trump personified it, and so now we can identify it, we can see it, and it's like a beast that's just grown. And so I would look at it more as an evolution of this thing that's been continually going on throughout history.
Has it, I'm just curious if COVID played a role in the acceleration of it. And also, one element that just comes to mind, like the reason I say that is because I think two things in the last few years that have really torn a lot of churches up. One is the politics, and then linked to that is like masking and vaccines and things like that, and conspiracy theorization. And I'm wondering how much all of those things kind of fit together into a nationalist far right ideology.
So Trump, it was I don't want to give him too much credit, but one thing that he deserves a lot of credit for was his ability to redefine truth and to put anything and everything into question. No one before him has ever had the audacity to do stuff like that, and so as a result of that, when you begin questioning truth in such a way where you can just deny it and things like objective facts don't even mean anything anymore, when stuff like that happens, you have created the perfect milieu for conspiracy theories, because now those things have legitimacy behind it because you can either accept it or not accept it. It's just in a Trump worldview, it's just as rational to accept that as it would be a scientific evidence for something to the contrary. And so his ability to redefine that has created this perfect opportunity for conspiracy theories to grow.
Have you looked at the Great Replacement theory and the role that this kind of ideology, I'm thinking about conspiracies and so on, about immigrants displacing whites, what role that plays? And then just related to that, like there's been a lot of talk recently about Trump praising Hitler and generals that Hitler had and so on. And Is there any link to be made, do you think, for Trump being fascist?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that when people use terms like Nazi or stuff like that, it's exaggerated. But I don't think fascist is an exaggeration. I think it's a perfect explanation as to, I mean, if he's clearly different from what is would we would consider mainstream or normal for being a person of the president or of that status, right? We have this idea in our head of what that person should look like and how they should act. And he sort of bucks all that. He creates his own rules and is nowhere near what that image in our minds are. So um, that that alone shows that he's in a different category from other people. Take that in conjunction with his beliefs and the things that he espouses, and you have fascism. And I don't think that's even, I don't even say that to be like mean or I just think that's a good way of describing it.
So when they talk, when Christians talk and Trump supporters talk about making America great again, we've all heard that ad nauseum for the last 9 years. What is it that they want to return to? And this has been one of the common questions, right? It's like, do you want to return to the Jim Crow era? You want to return to the era before women had the right to vote? Like, what does it mean? What is the idyllic period of American history that they want to return to? How do you understand that rhetoric to function?
So Trump is a businessman. And so if he has an expertise, it's how to get rich, how to have money, how to have wealth, how to have happiness as he understands it. And I think that anytime I hear mega, I think to myself the 1950s. And I feel like that's sort of like because it's post World War II. We had a huge economic boom after World War II because of all the stuff we were able to make for the war. And so as a result of that, housing and suburbs and all of these things sprouted up. And there was a time period where we were wealthy, where the average American did well for themselves, the average white American did well for themselves. And I think he is thinking of that, but what he's not thinking of is the fact that he's only understanding that through his whiteness. There is a whole other context that exists within that. That is, you build sub
Oops, sorry. Let's
that
keep
means
going.
you that's okay. So if you are going to build suburbs for some, that means you're going to displace others. If you he's because he's won, he wins, he's a winner at business, and like for him that's good, that's the ethical good for him, and it shows how good he is at what he does. And it doesn't matter if there are losers. It doesn't matter if you need to compensate them. None of that matters if as long as you're a winner. And so he looks at all the things really white Americans does because he has no like context of anything other than being a white privileged business person. And so that's what he's referring to. And the reason I think that makes people um, make them kind of, some at least, kind of like, ooh, is for those who know that era, know of the all of the like redlining and all of the stuff that the government did to minorities. But the reason a large chunk of people can get on board with that is they are mostly white and older and have context to the 50s. They were part of the ones moving into the suburbs. They were the ones who had job security and experienced the wealth that Trump is talking about. And so I think that's why it resonates so much with this group.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis. Of course, the glorious 50s may be the days of happy days, but it predates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And as someone in an interracial marriage, it predates Loving v. Virginia, which was a Supreme Court case that guaranteed the right to have interracial marriages in 1967. So, yeah, if you're just white and you never think about those things, that may seem like an idyllic period, but certainly not to many other people, I would think.
Right. It's like happy days. That's what I think of. Happy days.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, so how much? Well, here's the question. Here's the question. So there's been a lot of, and I think justified criticism of the hypocrisy of evangelical leaders who said with Trump, justified voting for him, supporting him because we're not choosing a pastor, we're choosing a president. And yet those very same people condemned Bill Clinton by saying character matters. My question is, have these people changed, or did Trump unveil a hypocrisy that was always there?
Oh, well, wow, there's a lot to that. Yes, he unveiled a hypocrisy that was always there. But what he also did was allow them to be able to flip-flop that way because he's redefined truth, right? So these and honestly, I think this goes to a larger conversation about the ability for some to critically think, um, and also, and I'm gonna there will be a lot of people who disagree with me on this. Abortion is the significantly well in today's age you could also add sexuality, but for the most part abortion has been the issue that has always driven these types of leaders to um, zealously support people like that. Now, if you'll, I think it was Paula White who was responsible for creating this narrative that Trump was reformed, that that all of those things about his character were of the past, and that he had become a Christian, and that you could trust her to know that these things were true. She's known him forever, and she's in his campaign still. Um, and so I think that you want to believe that those things are true. And if you want to believe that those things are true, you have no problem that gets you off the hook. That you may feel some sort of ethical responsibility. You don't have to worry about that anymore. She sort of gives permission for you to support her. And I think so that's the intentional part of it. I think that there are people who know that that's what they're doing. But on the other hand, there's a lack of critical thinking within the church. That's just a larger religious problem, but it's acute within evangelicalism, I think. Um, and so as a result of that, it's easy to bring parishioners along with you because they are not questioning. They're basically told through various forms of media, whether that's Fox News or their favorite preacher on the radio or whatever. So all of those things sort of create this uh, box. This is the illustration I give in the book that there's this box that they've created, and that box is their worldview, and they think that that's how everybody else thinks. When in reality, there's a whole world outside of that box that's different from what's inside it.
I hear when I talk with like Trump supporters, Christian conservatives, the most common justification is abortion. That abortion is this stain on the country. Some of the more extreme rhetoric not only says it's murder, but it's child sacrifice. And it's always tough to say, to discern whether people are treating that as a metaphor or in some sense literal. But from your perspective, to what degree does a concern about a pro-life stance on abortion, single issue voting, motivate people to support Trump versus broader concerns about white Christian privilege in society?
So I would say that. So first of all, most people may not know this, but when the issue of abortion really started being talked about in religious context, people were supportive of Roe v. Wade. Religious people were. In fact, there were public statements made by various trusted organizations saying that we believe that these sorts of things should happen. It was Francis and Frank Schaeffer who were tasked with creating a language, creating a way of thinking about this issue. And it's so funny how these things are all connected about that issue. And that issue actually was brought up to combat interracial relationships going on at Christian universities, like Bob Jones and stuff like that. And so, but what they didn't realize what happened at the time was the arguments were so compelling for being this language, pro life, and the different types of verbiage we use to rally people around, that was all created intentionally as a political stunt, and it just took off like it was something people connected to. And just like your last question, people don't understand the sort of hypocrisy or the contradiction that exists in being pro-life and yet against a woman's right to choose. And so how is her life any less important? And different conversations and arguments like that. So there are a ton of these contradictions that exist, and I think that there are many out there who are just comfortable enough to not have to worry about them, and as long as they're given good arguments that they can rationalize, that justifies it for them.
So it's fair to say that in your view, for many today, that this stance on supporting Trump because he's a little bit more pro-life, although he's saying send it back to the states, right? He's not saying he's calling for
Mm-hmm.
a ban, but he's still a
Right.
little more pro-life than the Democrats, and that's sufficient. That's a rationalization to support him. Obviously, not for all people, but you think that's fairly common.
Yep, absolutely. And I
Okay.
think that that's what you're seeing happening. The primary reason why they're going to support any Republican candidate. And we know that's true because they were willing to support Trump. I mean, he would be the exception. If there was any person for them not to accept as a Republican, it would be him. And yet they still accepted him. So, yes, they're going to go with anybody who is Republican, and they're needing is the justification to do that. And that's what a lot of the time that their leaders spend is creating these justifications.
I remember it was, I think, comparing Trump to King Cyrus. So you have like this was, I think, 9 years ago, a lot of conversation that comparing Trump to a pagan king who God used, and so God's similarly using Trump. And so you get those rationalizations, and then you get he's a baby Christian convert and all sorts of other stuff in between, anything to kind of reduce, I guess, the cognitive dissonance of voting.
Yep.
Where does this leave you in terms of where do you think this Christian nationalism is going? Let's talk a little bit of futuristic speculation here. Depending on how the election goes, do you think it's going to peter out? Do you think it's going to turn in itself and collapse? Or do you think it's going to continue to grow and become a greater socio-political force?
It's going to grow and become a greater force. And I'll tell you why I think that. A lot of people look to things like exit polls and just like polling interviews like does when they do their calls. And they get like, so Trump has been this sort of like spokesman, if you will, or big public figure for white Christian nationalism, right? But he is not the litmus test for what the future holds. I think local elections is the litmus test. And I know I live in West Michigan and it's very conservative here. But white Christian nationalism is huge from school boards to mayoral to gubernatorial. I mean, if you were to take an analysis of the way a picture of what the US looked like, we'll say in the year 2000, and then took another picture and you added white Christian nationalism to that conversation, you probably wouldn't really see a whole lot of a few stragglers in 2000. But in 2024, you're going to see a lot. You're going to see a ton. People who are actually okay with defending that sort of worldview. And even so like right now we have school boards that we're going to be voting for and stuff like that, and everybody is talking about, well, I want to vote for them but I don't know if they're a white Christian nationalist, or I mean, that's the conversations in a small community like where I live that people are having, and they're having this all over the country. And this is something that has been a part of evangelicalism's history, actually. This starting with the youth is not a new thing. This is a throwback to the 90s when the church decided the only way we can influence culture is by getting at the youth. So you had purity culture and you had all these things that began to happen in the 90s. Well, it was in the 80s too, but primarily in the 90s. And so what they're doing is they're taking that model and they're applying it here, saying if we can get the youth, then we have the future. And that's the game plan, I think.
I'm thinking in terms of back in '83, I think there was a court case, Supreme Court case about creationists arguing for equal time in the public schools for creationism alongside evolution. That didn't go well, but there's been a long history of trying to control public school education. I think one group I hear a lot about in the US is Moms for Liberty. And I
Mm,
think that they're very active in getting representatives that support these kinds of views. I would think white Christian nationalist views, broadly speaking, on school boards in just the way you describe. And yeah, if people aren't paying attention, then bottom up kind of a shift of a
yeah.
culture, it could be pretty significant.
So,
So yeah,
we might see a gap for a little bit, but you're not going to see this thing peter out.
so what do you advocate for a Christian who's concerned with the continued growth of this Christian nationalism from Moms for Liberty straight up to Doug Wilson, straight to Donald Trump? How should a Christian begin to respond as a prophetic witness against it?
Yeah. So the one thing they need to do is they need to do the research. So, like for local elections, we have several, we'll say Republican, but they're different Republicans. So there are the Republicans that we would call white Christian nationalists, and there are the Republicans that are sort of your traditional type Republicans, and they don't want anything to do with the white Christian nationalists. And so, but they don't come out and say I'm a white Christian nationalist or I'm a traditional Republican. What you need to do is you need to sort of do a little bit of research. And I have a friend who is running for school board, and I'm not too close to him. I should say he's more of an acquaintance. And when I learned that he was running, he had made this statement on his website, uh, God and traditional values, those key words that are important. And I emailed him. I said, "Hey, I'm all for faith in what you're doing and stuff like that, but I'm just going to be upfront. Are you a white Christian nationalist or not? Because everybody uses the same rhetoric, and you can never know based on that whether or not they're going to fall into that category. So you got to look a little bit deeper into each person because you don't know which one is going to be which."
Hmm. So what about worshiping alongside one another at the local church? How deep does the division run between this expression of Christianity, white Christian nationalism, versus I don't know if it's too contentious to say just historic orthodoxy? I know that they're going to say, well, it's you guys who are not the orthodox ones. So we can argue that all day, but how
Mm-hmm.
how big is the divide? Is there room for people to worship alongside one another in a pew?
There is, but and this gets discussed in the book too. There is so if you're more on the evangelical or conservative side of things, and you want to have people in your church that have diversity of opinion, that's not going to work because you've already begin with the premise that you're right, that your absolutism comes in and says you're the one with the truth, right? So anybody else would not have the truth. If you're more on the progressive side, you tend to think, well, I definitely want diversity in my church. Of course, most of them are just thinking like racial or ethnic or stuff like that. But what you really need to be thinking about is also ideological differences. So at my church, we have a good blend of both. And the only reason it works is this: our core um, belief is that questions are okay and we're all on this journey together. If you don't think questions are okay and you don't teach people how to think for themselves, then all you're doing is creating ideologues. All you're doing
Hmm.
is propaganda. But if you create an atmosphere of curiosity, then you allow for the opportunity to get different opinions together. They can cohabitate, but you got to start at that foundation and say, "I'm okay. we can debate and have great conversations about this, but at the end of the day, we're still brothers and sisters, and we still have a calling to do, right? Um, but part of that is, again, where are you beginning? What context are you beginning with? Evangelicals and conservatives will have to give up some important things they may not be willing to give up to achieve that, if that's even anything they want.
I had a debate. You mentioned Frank Schaeffer earlier. So Francis Schaeffer's son. I had a debate with him a few years ago on the question of being evangelical, and I was defending it in a radio debate, and he was taking it. But I was saying not evangelical the way that Trump supporters are. So frankly, I lost everybody. I didn't have anyone supporting me because I was arguing a position that nobody wanted to defend. You could be
Right.
evangelical but not be a Trump supporter. But one
Right.
thing that he shared that I really appreciated was he talked about the cognitive dissonance. I'm gonna describe it that way. That he has a neighbor who's a Trump supporter, and yet their family are the nicest people, and they reach out to others in the community, and they help the poor and the indigent and so on. And he was trying to bring together support for Trump with this. But the one thing he said is, I don't know how to explain all that, but I do know that they're good people. And I think I struggle over this because I think Trump
Yeah.
himself is just an awful person.
Right.
But also there are, if we can't find respect for those who we disagree with and the choices they're making, then I don't know how we're ever going to get together. So how do we build those bridges without having contempt or being dismissive of people, even when we think, and this of course goes both ways, that they're making fundamentally wrong judgments about very serious political and social issues?
Okay. So I think that there is a fundamental theological issue um, that is not talked about, and I think is sort of the um, foundation for this. So we're all familiar with the terminology to, you're to be in the world but not of the world, and this idea that uh, that the culture is against us. So in modern times, there is this huge persecution complex that exists. In the early Roman Empire, they were not socially oriented, right? So Jesus comes along and really produces a belief system that has a strong emphasis on the social aspect of
Hmm.
being a faithful witness of God. And so we have that, right? So now move through history to today, and we have a culture that's the opposite, right? Now we're more sensitive to those things. We're more socially oriented. The problem with that is because of this mindset that we're to be against the world or against culture, we end up being against the things we're supposed to be for. And that ends up becoming a problem. We've not seen this change that's occurred throughout the history, having that larger picture of things. And so we end up being our own worst enemies, and we end up opposing things we shouldn't be opposing, or at least we may not like the way that it's articulated, and maybe that needs nuance. But for the most part, like I call myself pro-life, but that's because but I'm pro-choice, but I'm for life in all areas, whether that's immigration or whatever. I want life for everybody, not just a baby or not just a mother or not just the immigrant, right? And so that sort of idea is so foreign to people because they just have this initial, like, oh, the president said, the Democratic president said this, or our Democratic government said this, so that's something I'm automatically supposed to oppose. And things like, so like Me Too, or any of those hashtag movements you can think of, like so many of those, regardless of how political the organization might be behind it, what they're trying to do is important Jesus work. Racial reconciliation is important Jesus work. And but because it comes out as a political thing and because it's a cultural thing, we just have that automatic like hesitation, like it must be bad. And so we begin creating all of these justifications for why we should be against it. Instead of thinking, what are the things I can take from it that are good? and use that to help promote the kingdom of God. Sorry, I got off
Yeah.
preaching.
No, no, no. I was thinking of when the Black Lives Matter movement was really taking off. I think right around George Floyd in 2020, I think it was.
Hmm.
And so then the response to the refrain "Black Lives Matter" from some was "All lives matter." And then somebody took that and applied it to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," and then someone says, "Well, blessed are all people, Jesus," kind of missing the point of what he was doing there.
Right.
So here then I'm going to ask this, and as we wind our time down, what is then the good that we can find or we can appreciate within Christian nationalism or within the MAGA movement? Is there anything like that? I'll put it in terms of missiology. So a point of contact, famous missionary Don Richardson talked about in every culture, you should look for points of contact, something you can affirm and then build from there. Just what Paul does in Acts 17 when he's in Athens. What are the things that we can build on common values, shared values with Trump supporters, with MAGA movement, with Christian nationalists that does begin to build that mutual civility and appreciation for one another and hopefully begin to establish a more civil discourse.
So I think that it's important to distinguish between Donald Trump as a white Christian nationalist and your neighbor, say.
Mhm.
I believe Donald Trump knows exactly what he's doing. I do not think my neighbor does. I think that, and so because of that, they're two different types of people, right? There are things I can find with common ground with my neighbor. There's nothing I can find with Trump. But in everything that is out there for ideas, there's a grain of truth in most, right? And those are the things we need to be looking for. The bad guy, if there are good guys and bad guys here, the bad guy is the one who knows that and is purposely distorting it. Then there are the unintentional victims, which I think a lot of people fall into that category, who have, because there's a grain of truth, are so easily able to rationalize it. And so they follow them. Um, and so I think those, not we, because I don't know who your audience is, but those who are not part of that, it's easy to say I'm a tolerant person until I encounter somebody that I really disagree with, and then my tolerance, I throw it out the window. And I don't think these types of people are even saying they're tolerant people. I'm saying like people like me will say that. So if I truly believe that, I can't just be accepting of certain social things and not the other. And I still got to care for them just as much as I care for everybody else. And so it should be just as much part of our mission to find those aspects of commonality and have some emotional maturity along with it, to have good conversations as two human beings. We're both on looking for truth. We're both on a path and searching for certain things. And we have to be more humble, and we have to understand that when we come in contact with another person, they do have something to offer us, even if before that conversation we don't know what that is. And I think having that sort of like changed mindset is the start.
That's great because I think it was interesting. There's a parallel here that just as you were saying, going into the future, you think the fight really with Christian nationalism growing in that is going to be from the bottom up. So a response to it is in a radical sense from the bottom up through building, knitting together and healing relationships between people and rebuilding that mutual respect and understanding for one another. Eric, thank you very much. It's been great, everybody. Again, the book coming out 2025 January is Kingdom of Man, Evangelicalism and the Distortion of Christianity. And I've also linked below Eric's book, Unenlightenment, A Theological Foundation for Deconstructing and Reconstructing the Christian Faith. Yeah, Eric, thanks again for joining us.
All right. Thanks for having me.